Okay, yeah, I was just looking for the record button. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for our kind of a little update on plant diseases. We're not going to talk about insects today. I thought I'd save that for another session, possibly. So we're just going to go over plant diseases today, how to identify them, things to look for, and kind of a better explanation of plant diseases. So just some housekeeping. If you guys will please make sure you keep your microphones muted, and I think you can leave your videos on. If the internet starts getting sketchy, or like it's going in and out or something, you may just want to look down on the bottom left hand of your screen, and you can do a stop video, and that saves on some bandwidth. And so if we start having problems, I may just have to ask you to stop your videos. But it seems like it's okay right now, as long as everybody is hearing everything. Also, sign in the chat box if you would, just so I have a record of who attended today. And if you are not already on my distribution list, you can go ahead and put your contact information in there. We may have had some people that picked it up from the Facebook site or such, but go ahead and just sign in, say hi in the chat box. You can put your questions in the chat box. Since I am teaching, it's going to be hard for me to monitor it. So I would really like to go through the program and then go back and answer the questions. So if you have a burning question and you're afraid you're going to forget it, maybe just go ahead and type it into the top chat box, and then we'll review those at the end. Okay? Does that sound good to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Get my glasses on here. Okay, in this presentation, we're going to do an introduction to basic plant diseases and the disease triangle. We're going to look at an overview of plant pests and pathogens, which are fungi, bacteria, virus, and nematodes. And so, first thing we ask is, what is a plant disease? We often have a lot of confusion on, between a plant disease. It may be a cultural problem. It could be an insect. So one of your first things is going to be, correct ID of what the problem is, so that you're not spraying a pesticide on something that you don't need to. So let's see. When defining the plant disease, we can either do it in a broad sense, considering anything that causes damage to the plant, or we can consider it in the narrow sense, which typically is limited to damage caused by the living organisms, exclusive of herbivores. We have a lot of things that feed on our garden plants too. Most people think of disease in the narrow sense, which includes damage from organisms like fungi, nematodes, bacteria, virus, insects, and parasitic plants. So if you look at this screen here, you can see there's a lot of, you could have genetic abnormalities, sorry about that, in your plants. We also have disorders that are abiotic or abiotic and non-abiotic, air pollutants, chemicals, your soil, and looking at new neighborhoods where they're building new houses and stuff. The soil, it just kills me to even go by and look at plants, and people are trying to grow plants in these areas, and so your soil can cause a lot of problems with the plants. Nutrient imbalances, oxygen, drought, heat or frost, mechanical impact. And then if we look at the living or biotic, that's what we're going to kind of focus on today, is the viruses, bacteria, and such, as I mentioned before. Now, for a disease to occur, three things must be present. You must have a pathogen, an active pathogen or a pest, a susceptible host, and an environment that is conducive to infection or infestation. Adjusting any of these three factors can change how much damage we would expect from a pathogen or a pest. So if we were to make the environment, here we go, make the environment a little less conducive for infection, especially for fungal pathogens, maybe doing things like better timing on irrigation, making sure that you're not running your irrigation and getting the plants wet and that sits overnight. Okay, somebody needs to mute. Okay. I was catching some background noise there, sorry. But anyway, there are things that we can do in the garden that make it a less favorable environment for the disease to grow. So, that includes irrigation is very important. Make sure that we're not watering over the top, and especially going into the evening hours where we already have, the plant going into a moist environment. If you can go into that time of the day dry, that helps. So maybe if you're irrigating or want to give a little shower to your plants, do that in the morning when they have time to dry off, before they have to sit overnight in the dew and the wet. Your plant spacing makes a huge difference. We talked about that last month in one of our webinars. Correct plant spacing. You want room for air to circulate through so that plant can dry out. If you have an east-facing slope where you can put your gardens and your plants, that when the sun comes up, they get the full heat of the morning sun and the afternoon sun and can dry out a little bit quicker. And so if we can eliminate one side of the triangle, maybe by selecting a host plant that is resistant to the pathogen, we can eliminate that disease entirely. Although the pathogen is always there in the environment and still conducive to disease, without a susceptible host, we won't get the disease. So our plants that are resistant to a certain fungal pathogen, resistance means that they can hold up better to it and are less likely to get the disease, but it doesn't mean that they cannot get a disease. If the conditions are right, you have that host plant, you have the pathogen there, those three things working together can definitely cause a plant to have a disease, even if it's labeled as resistant. So we have pests that we usually look at. Right? We have our pathogens, and then we have our insects. And like I said, we'll look at insects in another time. Plant pathogens, we look at nematodes, we have viruses, fungi, and bacteria. And on those plant, whoops, I need to go back one. Whoops. On those plant pests, we're going to go through some of the characteristics of the major pathogens that you see here. Okay, there we go. Now the number of plant pathogens, this chart shows, okay, like fungi, we have 10,000 different fungi that can affect 100,000 different species of plants. Bacteria, we might name 400, and they will attack 4,000 species of plants, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the way we keep track of things. And so you can see by far the fungal organisms are what we deal with the most. Secondly would be bacteria and viruses, and nematodes are usually not a problem for home gardeners, but they can be in specific crops, especially tomatoes tend to get root knot nematode, or boxwoods in the landscape get nematodes and such like that. So let's talk about the fungi. Our characteristics of our fungi, sorry. The characteristics that define these groups also define the control options for that particular disease. So spraying a fungicide on a virus-infected plant is not going to get rid of your pest problem. So it's very important to realize that and identify what the problem is before you go to treat them. And so since our fungi are our main group of attackers, I guess you'd say. But they're characterized as multicellular organisms that can contain a true nuclei. They have cell walls and typically reproduce by spores. Some parts of the fungi may be visible to the naked eye, while others are microscopic. So the basic fungal structures consist of a vegetative body composed of a hyphae, which are collectively termed as mycelium. And you can see the mycelium there on the left-hand side. And those are survival structures. And sclerotia, those are also survival structures, and that's what it will overwinter in the soil or in plant debris and allow those fungi to overwinter and cause a problem the next year. And so that's one of the reasons that we recommend rotating your crops in the garden. Don't grow the same family in the same place year after year after year, or those organisms are going to build up. And even when you're planting resistant plants, you're still going to have problems because those organisms get in the soil and they overwinter and they stay there. So rotating crops is a good way to avoid getting some of these fungal diseases. Oops, sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot to turn my phone off there. All right, some of our common fungal symptoms and diseases on plants. You're going to see stem rot, damping off. We see a lot of that in our bedding plants or when we start seeds at home. The little plants will be growing great one day, and the next day, boom, they're all falling over. So that can be caused by overwatering, not enough air circulation, and things of that nature. So we also see root and crown rots, which is usually Phytophthora would be the organism. Different lesions on the leaves, fruit, and stems of plants. Anthracnose is a common one where we look for lesions on the leaves. We can also watch for wilt. Fusarium wilt, verticillium wilt is something that is common in our clay soils, mainly because they hold water so much, and those organisms can overwinter. So you definitely, when you're choosing tomatoes, just pull out the tag and look at it, and it should say Fusarium resistant, verticillium resistant. So try to select those varieties that have that resistance to it. All kinds of leaf spots on different plants that we see each year. Mildew, the symptom, you can actually see the powdery mildew on the surface. Downy mildew, you don't really see the powdery. You can see that more on the underside of the leaves. So the way a plant gets infected, they have to find a natural opening in the plant. And if they can't find a natural opening, they can actually penetrate the plant tissue using a specialized structure called an apressorium. That is a flattened piece of mycelium that uses pressure to drive a penetration peg through the epidermis of the plant, and it allows that mycelium to begin growing either intra or intracellularly through the plant. So it makes its own way into the plant if it doesn't have its own way of opening. But a way of opening could be, like if you nicked a tree with a weed eater or bumped it with a lawnmower and that created an opening, that would be one way that fungi can get into plants is injuries. So fungi are spread through wind, water, soil, seed and plant material, and also equipment. So you want to be careful about using your equipment, especially if you're going from one garden to the next. Clean, sanitize your equipment in between gardens, especially if you know that you have a disease problem so that you're not spreading it from one area to another. Pruning shears, clippers, if you're pruning trees and such like that. It's good to disinfect those in between cuts, especially if you're dealing with something like fire blight or another bacterial disease. You want to make sure that you're not spreading that. And we can also spread these diseases ourselves on the bottom of our shoes. So when we go into the garden and we have mud on our shoes, we may pick up the fungi or bacteria and carry it to another part of the garden. So you can just clean your shoes in between. Things of that nature will help reduce transferring that pathogen. So what you're seeing now here is southern blight. And we've seen a lot of southern blight last year in tomatoes, pepper, and hemp. It's real easy to identify. Just one day, the plant will be healthy, and the next day you'll look out across the field and you'll have one or two that will just be wilted, laying over. And if it's gone long enough, you're going to see these spores or sclerotia at the base of the plant and going into the soil. Sometimes you don't see this white. The plant will actually wilt and fall over without developing this. That comes on later on. But we can identify it through the lab by taking samples and making slides and looking for those fungal spores under the microscope and get those diseases identified. Because it's very similar to a verticillium wilt or a fusarium wilt. Those also will cause a plant just to, up and die. And if you've got a plant that's wilted, even though you've watered regularly, definitely start checking it at the base and see if you see any of these spores growing on it. Other signs, you could cut the inside of it, and there's things that that we can look for. The browning on the inside of the stem, there's some staining that goes on. So, but if you're not sure, you can always bring it to your extension office or send us pictures, and we'll be glad to look at those closer. So, management. One thing would be resistant plants. You want to make sure that you've got clean seed and stock, clean equipment, proper drainage and aeration, crop rotation. Then we have some biological controls and chemical controls through your fungicides. Now, this is a bacteria. Bacteria are less complex than fungi. These organisms are single-celled and much smaller than the fungal spores. They cannot be seen with the naked eye, and they're hard to see with the microscope unless you really, really, really know what you're doing. So most bacteria have cell walls, and this helps determine the shape of the bacteria. They can be round or spiral shaped or rod shaped, and this helps in identifying the different species of bacteria. So nearly all of our plant pathogenic bacteria are rod-shaped. So other shape can include those with no cell walls, those that produce long filaments, similar to fungal mycelium. So like I said, these are kind of harder to identify. It's more by the symptoms, identifying the plant and looking at the symptoms when you go into the bacterial diseases. So some of the bacterial diseases will look very similar to fungal diseases. So our bacterial diseases we look for, again, very important to know the crop that you're dealing with, what type of plant you have, because we have specific diseases for specific plants. So a bacterial rot, we see that in the brassicas, the broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, and that will cause the soft rot that you would see in a rainy year. That's going to be very prolific. Sometimes you will see a canker, bacterial canker, or a wilt. Normally you're seeing a canker on the stem, or you could see a lesion on the stem. So we have bacterial spot, a wide range of our vegetables. We see bacterial speck on tomatoes, bacterial blight on peas, bacterial brown spot. So there is a lot to learn there. And so how do we tell the difference between a bacterial wilt and verticillium wilt on the bottom? Normally that plant would have to be pulled up and I'd have to do some dissecting on it and again make a slide, put it under the microscope and see what's going on. Thank goodness we can send these pictures to the lab, send these instead of having to send in a complete sample of the plant. We can send these pictures and a good description, and then we can get a diagnosis from the lab and give you the recommendation on what you need to do. So this is the bacterial under a microscope, and you can see this streaming of bacterial organisms coming out. And of course, that is very highly magnified. But as a plant geek, I think this stuff is pretty cool. I love making slides and trying to identify all this stuff. So the infection, it can go in through natural openings like your stomata, the lenticels on the plants, wounds, insect vectors can carry viruses, especially viruses and bacteria both. They also can spread, bacteria, same as fungi, can spread through wind, water, seed, soils, plant material, the equipment, and our insect vectors. Survival of a pathogen, most decline, without a host. That just makes sense there. Some are saprophytes, ephytes, and some are soil survival. Some survive in the soil. Your saprophytes will latch onto another plant. So, and it will pull its resources, its food and water that's needed from them. Okay. Let me go back one. I think I'm off them. Almost all bacteria reproduce primarily in the host plant. How long these bacteria remain viable without a host varies. Some of the bacteria will decline in number in soil. And these, and like I said, insect vectors can be very particularly important for the dispersal. Other bacteria build up in populations in the host plant, and these populations only decline slightly in the soil. So these bacteria can be very dangerous if populations are allowed to build up over time by continually planting a susceptible host. And so these bacteria end up as soil inhabitants. So our control options depend on the disease, but many of the cultural controls options listed here on the screen are similar to what we saw for fungal diseases. Planting resistant cultivars is one of the most effective means of bacterial disease control, and a number of plant species are available with varied resistant to diseases. Our bacteria, unlike the fungi, the bacteria does not survive in the soil. And they do have a limited host range, but crop rotation is still an important management option. Sanitation practices are very important for controlling these bacterial diseases. Bacteria can survive in the plant material left in the field, so it's important to remove those. Do a good cleanup of your garden. Burn or remove those plants at the end of the season. If it's mid-season and you've got a bad disease, just remove those plants and get rid of them completely. And don't plant something that's going to be easily infected back in that same spot. We talked about, soil sterilization. That is an option for controls on some diseases. But we can talk about that if you've got questions on soil sterilization. I won't get into the details of that right now. So, okay, on the viruses. Viruses are not actually living organisms. They are composed of clumps of protein and nucleic acid. These clumps of molecules can only multiply inside the host cells. And some people think that these things are wayward genes that have gotten loose, and others think viruses were once pathogens like fungi and bacteria, but just kept dropping unnecessary parts, realizing they could do everything their host could do. Individual virus particles are extremely small and can only be seen using an electron microscope, and they're very tricky because the viruses attach to these proteins and they can change based on the environment that they are growing in. So we have these little things called viroids. They don't have a protein coat, but they can act like a virus. Virus symptoms, you can see in here the hosta. We have some stunting, we have chlorosis, we have mosaics and ring spots. The color breaking, as you see in the second picture down, would be more of a mosaic. Leaf distortion, a lot of time viruses can be mistaken for herbicide damage. Because they will cause the leaves to curl up and similar to a drift from a herbicide. So that's why they've got to be looked at very closely and investigated before you make a decision on what to spray. So your plant diseases cannot be controlled with a spray or anything like that. Usually they are spread by insects. You know, they can be spread by the wind or the weather too. So if you can just clip those things off your plants when you start to see damage, maybe look for aphids or other insects and try to control the insects. If that doesn't work, you're going to have to get rid of the plant completely. So here you see some mosaic diseases on our zucchini. This happens on watermelons too. The tomato spotted wilt virus, you'll see the wilting plant that we seen in the slide earlier, but you will also see this discoloration and markings on the fruit. Tomato spotted wilt virus, it can be spread by smoking and working in the garden. So don't use tobacco products while working with Solanaceae type plants, or you can spread that tobacco mosaic virus into the tomato plant or into another Solanaceae plant. So fungal spread in our plants. Let's see. Oop, sorry, I keep that popping up there. Okay, so I went over this. Okay, okay. So we have inoculation. We have cell-to-cell spread. The virus enters the phloem, it becomes systemic, and then it will go down to the roots, and it also appears in the young leaves. So here, oh, wait a minute. Yeah. I'm going to go back a second. I'm sorry. I didn't review this good enough. Okay, so often they lay eggs first. Okay. And then the egg hatches, juveniles come out, and they go through a series of 4 molts. And then the adult will come in. Oh, wait a minute. That's not right. I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself on my notes here. This is just how the virus is spread. So essentially, it'll come in, one will come in, and then it'll spread from cell to cell, enter the phloem, become systemic, and then can appear in the roots and the young leaves. Vectors, aphids, leafhoppers, white flies, mealybugs, thrips, and beetles, nematodes, fungi, dodder, mites. Again, mechanical injury, vegetative propagation, and seed. It can be spread through when you graft plants. They're doing a lot of grafting of tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and everything for disease resistant root rot diseases. And so those people that are growing or grafting plants in the greenhouses have to be very careful. And also your seed can be infected. So chemical controls on viruses, there are none. Your cultural controls basically are your resistant varieties. Make sure you're getting clean seed and transplant. Sanitation, remove the plants as they become infected, and then try to control those vector populations. There's your nematode. Okay. So nematodes are parasitic roundworms. They're found in the soil, the leaf litter, the water, the plant surfaces. They can be inside the plant tissue, on or inside animals. They feed on just about every type of biological creature, and about 10% are plant parasites. We don't see these very often. In a home garden, we do see them, but it's very rare. We may see tomato rot nematode. There's a carrot rot nematode. Boxwoods, I see it a lot in the landscape. So you do have to have a soil test. There's a special way to pull soil tests and send in for nematode sampling. So, okay, here's where I got ahead of myself. So, okay, so the life cycle of the nematode, basically the egg comes in and then it hatches. This is the juvenile stage. Then we have the adult male or female. There we go. So that's basically your life cycle of the nematode. Um, the adult female looks very different from the male because the female is swollen and can't move anymore at this point. When you see that round one in the corner there, but she can't move or do anything. She's just going to lay eggs and start to cycle all over again. So above ground symptoms you might see in nematodes would be poor growth, chlorosis, wilting. Below ground, when you pull up the roots of these plants, you may see the little gall looking attachments to the roots, like this one right here in the middle. That is not normal for a carrot. Now, sometimes we see carrots that just grow odd like this because of our rocky soil too. So what you're really looking for is those little round, little egg-looking things on the roots of the plant. So as I said, few nematode pests in the Tennessee gardens. Southern root knot nematode can be problematic in cucumber, melons, okra, peas, and such like that, but we really don't see much of a problem with that here. Okay, they do spread, and they can actively swim, move less than about 3 foot per season, so they will stay in the field. They will transfer on your boots, on equipment, attached to transplanters. It can be due to water runoff. So if you suspect a problem in a field, be very careful about your equipment and moving from one field to another, or one plant bed from one plant bed to the other. Management, disease resistant, tolerant cultivars, crop rotation, or fallow. And fallow is where you leave an area, put a cover crop on it, and just don't grow any vegetable crops on it for a year. You can plant that with clover or buckwheat, or depending on what season you want, but you're leaving that fallow. Basically, you're not growing vegetables in that area. Incorporate organic matter. Make sure that's worked into the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil. You can use the soil solarization. We do have grafting, building that resistant by grafting plants. And then there are limited options as far as chemical controls, fumigants, nematicides, and things like that you may see used more on a commercial level. So basically, in summary, when you're looking at plant disease, you have the 3 contributing factors. You have a susceptible host, you have the pathogen, and you have the right environment for them. Once you have those 3 things, you can have a disease to form. So understanding what that pathogen is or what the pest is going to form your foundation for control and for management. So the fungi, bacteria, nematodes, viruses, insects can all lead to issues in our home gardens. So again, it's important to identify what you've got. Okay. Let me open it back up to everyone. Or I can see everybody. I had you closed off there. So let me check the chat box. Where'd my chat box go? Okay, no questions in the chat box. You all can unmute yourself for a moment if you have any questions. Somebody raised their hand.
I have a question.
Okay.
So are nematodes different than like earthworms?
Yes. Yes, you cannot see a nematode without a microscope.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So, yep. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Y'all having any plant diseases? Things that you're worried about yet? I think mainly we've just been dealing with cold weather.
How would you get rid of powdery mildew?
Increasing your air circulation, and there are fungicides, just a home and garden fungicide that is labeled. Well, it depends. If it's on ornamentals, use a fungicide that's labeled for ornamentals. If it's in your vegetable garden, make sure you're using a fungicide labeled for use on edible plants.
And for like bugs that are making holes in our leaves, could you use like neem oil?
You could use neem oil for to help with those things. I've heard varied reactions to people. Some people swear neem oil is the greatest thing on earth, and other people said that it doesn't help at all. So, but we do include it in our recommendations for a lot of different pests.
And
kind of using it like a dormant oil.
Okay.
You know, it works very good on small body or soft bodied insects, your scales, your aphids, your white flies, and things of that nature.
And with diatomaceous earth, how do you correctly apply that around your garden or around your plants without it getting gross and pasty?
Well, it just does kind of get gross and pasty looking. When it gets to that point, you know, you can just kind of turn it over into the soil or into the mulch. So that is something that needs to be reapplied periodically. The diatomaceous earth is made of diatoms out of the ocean, which are small little pieces of diatoms, and they literally, when the insect crawls over it, it scratches them and causes them to dehydrate, and that's how it kills those insects. They may hit it and be repelled and just go away, or if they continue to slide through it like slugs and such, then it just literally cuts them until they pass away.
So it's not necessarily bad when it gets gooey, it's just I would need to reapply
Yeah, you would
because it's
just
not
need to,
working anymore?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And maybe, you know, maybe do less,
Okay.
because you really just need a little sprinkling around your plants that you're trying to protect. Make a border, a boundary around the plants.
Oh, I got you. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this. Do we have any other questions? Because I've got a little video I want to share with you all.